week's video. In these final segments of this series of videos looking at still life, we're going to work on a couple of pieces of work over the next 2 weeks and addressing one of the elements that we find in still life, which is a narrative, a story that can be happening. There are examples of these stories dating right through the history of the still life as an art form. But we see a blossoming in the 16th, 17th century of these themes being explored as the genre of still life really becomes a key art form, a recognised genre that artists are not only allowed to paint but encouraged to paint. Each week over the next 2 weeks, I want you to address one of these themes, and by looking back on your past work, combine everything that you've been doing, address one of these themes into either a drawing, a painting, a charcoal, an oil pastel, whatever medium you wish to explore it in. It can be colour, it can be black and white. I'm not worrying about any of that. As long as I'm able to see evidence of you thinking about either thinking right back to some of those earlier exercises where we did talk about standing further back and how the viewing the object from that distance is very much more in a modern view as opposed to viewing the still life or the object up closer, and that gets us back into more that Dutch master feel in our work. On to examples of thinking about those different compositions and thinking about setting up with those different compositional shapes, through to, and if you choose to work in colour, the colour exercises that we did, thinking about the main motive and its colour, and then using its complement in all senses as the background. You may also, and I would like to see, particularly bouncing off the exercises that we've done in the last 2 weeks, that you include in your still lives in the next couple of weeks at least either a metallic or a reflective object or something that is transparent, something that is glass in these still lifes as well. There are 4 narratives which I'm going to set, and I want you to choose one of the 4 for this week and one of the 4 for next week. The 4 genres that we're going to look at are the idea of vanitas, which is a key theme across still life, usually one way or the other, and has been addressed by artists from as far back as we can find artwork right up until the present day. The 5 senses of sight, touch, taste, smell, and hearing. The laid table, which is a classic Dutch masters narrative. And the final one is the flower piece, incorporating that idea that we see explode in Victorian times, particularly in England, about the language of flowers and using flowers to convey messages or meaning. The examples of paintings that I'm going to show you to illustrate these 4 narratives that you can use in your still lives are primarily from the 17th century, which, as I mentioned before, is a period that we see an explosion in the use of the still life as a means of conveying stories, information, any of the other words that we could use to describe the means to which and why artists paint and draw, do any of the things that we do. The examples that I'm going to show you being from that period, there is a heavy influence of religion on all of these four areas of narrative or undertones of religion in them, fairly moralising, telling people not to drink, not to indulge too much, the dangers of overindulgence, etc., etc. But as time has gone on, those same themes, these same narratives have been used and have evolved away from those initial use of them in the senses that I'm going to be showing you now. So don't feel that you've got to approach any of your exercises from the standpoints that these examples that I'm going to show you. These are purely just examples to give you a little bit of an idea of what you're looking for and maybe some of the symbology that you can use. I would encourage you to do some further research about the ones that particularly interest you, and maybe see and try and find some other examples of these being used up until more contemporary painters, if possible, too. Don't just stick back with the Dutch masters in like these examples that I've shown you. To start with, I want to look at the five senses. The five senses illustrate, as it suggests, the five senses of sight, taste, touch, sound, and smell. And in these examples that I can show you, you can see how they're very literal. Flowers are there for the sense of smell. Musical instruments or music score is used there to incorporate the idea of sound. Taste is often represented by some type of food, be it fruit or bread or something along those lines. And then you get to sight and touch. Now, this is where, particularly with touch, that you can see there's the money or the money purses, the playing cards. These are examples, as I said before, of the slight religious undertones, or the messaging is that within these paintings. And the last one, as I said, is sight. Now, sight is often either represented in these paintings with something being reflected in a mirror, or, as you can see in one of these examples, with a landscape or a view out a window, is often another way of incorporating that idea of sight within these paintings. The next narrative that we're going to discuss is the vanitas. As I said earlier, vanitas is often a theme that you find throughout all genres or all narratives of still life. whether they be the five senses as we've just discussed, or any of the other ones that we're going to discuss, the laid tables, etc. The Vanitas is one of those all-arcing themes. And the idea about the Vanitas is that they become, or they are describing almost the transient nature of our existence on this earth, describing maybe our short time, and that we should not waste it. They can also be quite critical of their time too. And for example, the Klaus here, the Vanitas still life with the skull, it's using books and things there. This is a painting from the time of the Enlightenment, as books were becoming a very important thing, a place where it was felt that knowledge could be recorded and kept. And here Peter Klaus is sort of criticising book knowledge and maybe its futility in the face of eternity. And he's being a bit sceptical about all that. As well as you can also see, he's using things like clocks and extinguished candles, the overturned cup, as all other objects symbolising the transience of all things. In the next example, we're going to look at the idea of the laid tables. Laid tables have their beginnings, particularly here at the period with the Dutch masters. Again, there is, and some of the symbology is quite lost now to us as modern audiences. Things like you'll see in these laid tables, the use of dried fish, and references to the Eucharist, bread, wine, etc., etc. But also there are elements of, and this is where you often see the peeled lemons or citrus fruits. And the idea behind those was, again, it's Puritanism coming through, the Dutch Puritists. The idea of diluting your wine so that you don't get drunk, and that you don't overindulge, etc., etc., is sort of some of the main themes where the laid table comes from. But we see the laid table continue right up into modern times. It's probably one of the subjects or the narratives that has maintained its existence in terms of still life. We can talk about Matisse's as being laid table, Cézanne's as being laid table, etc., etc. And that ideally it's a combination of food, of drink, laid out in a way that looks as though it's either just about to be eaten, in the middle of being eaten, or after a meal has taken place. The final examples that we're going to talk about here are the classic flower pieces. Now, don't be put off by these flower pieces. These are flower pieces of their period. I'm not expecting you to do a flower piece like one of these, but just for a few notes when we talk about these, is that is particularly their compositional elements, how they're built up with triangles and diagonals within them. It's your opportunity to play with some interesting compositional elements. And the other element that I would like you to consider here, and maybe, as I said before, as being part of your research, is looking into the language of flowers, or floriography, which is that certain flowers hold certain meanings, and this became a very big thing in Victorian times, but does date back to flower pieces like what we're viewing here, as eliciting messages to the viewer. Fortunately or unfortunately, these meanings to certain flowers have evolved and changed over time, and as I said, we see it sort of settling into sort of some kind of formal nature with the Victorians in the 19th century. But it would be an interesting thing to consider, perhaps trying to include a little bit of language of flowers in your flower piece, as well as taking into consideration some of those compositional elements that I've discussed. When we do look at these flower pieces by the Dutch masters, and one here that's a little bit later, that's an early 19th century one too, is that these, if when you actually study and look at the flowers within these still lifes, there are flowers and things going on there that that could no way at all be flowering at the same time. These flower pieces were built up from studies of individual flowers and placed the studies, drawings, maybe little paintings, would be referred to, and these large floral pieces put together from those studies. So they do become quite an interesting exercise if you did work in that way, but I'm not encouraging you to by any means at all. It's an interesting concept to think, because they become very much an exercise in composition. So good luck. If you have any questions, please don't hesitate to contact me and double check with anything. As I said, this week choose one of these narratives that we've just spoken about it and address it as best as you can using all of the previous week's exercises that we have been doing. Take care, and I'll speak to you soon.